Have you ever found yourself in a season of silence where it feels as if God has gone silent? You pray fervently day after day, seeking answers, and yet all you hear is an unsettling quiet. You ask, why is God not speaking to me right now? What's happening? In times like these, it's easy to feel abandoned or question whether God has truly heard your cries. But the truth is, silence isn't a sign of his absence. It's often a sign of something deeper at work. When God seems silent, it's not that he's forgotten about you or turned away. He's present in a way that requires us to lean in and trust him, even when we don't feel his voice in the same way we did before. God's silence isn't a rejection. It's a moment for you to grow deeper in your relationship with him. It's during these times that he's calling you to move beyond the surface and embrace a deeper faith. You see, we live in a world that is constantly filled with noise from social media, the demands of daily life, and our own inner turmoil. This noise can easily drown out God's voice, making it hard to hear him clearly. But when he is silent, it's as if he's asking you to tune in to a different kind of communication, a communication that's not dependent on words, but on trust and stillness. In moments of silence, God is cultivating something in you that words alone cannot express. Silence creates space for reflection, for prayer, and for the inner peace that can only come when you stop striving and start listening. Just because you can't hear him right now doesn't mean he's not working. In fact, it's often during these moments that he is doing the most profound work in your heart. Think about it. When you're in silence, you're forced to sit with your thoughts, your doubts, your fears, and even your pain. You have no choice but to confront these things, to bring them to God, and to surrender them before him. It's in that surrender that God begins to do the deep work of transformation. God's silence isn't something to fear or dread. It's an opportunity to learn to trust him in ways that you never have before. It's easy to follow God when you're receiving clear direction, when you're hearing his voice every day. But it's when the silence comes that your faith is truly tested. Will you trust him even when you can't see him at work? Will you believe in his promises, even when the road ahead seems unclear? In these moments of quiet, God is teaching you the most important lesson of all. Faith isn't dependent on feelings or circumstances. It's rooted in his unchanging character. The silence you're experiencing right now may be a space for God to refine you, to teach you and to bring you closer to his heart. It's in these quiet moments that he can reveal his will in a way that isn't just about the answers you seek, but about the deeper relationship he desires with you. You may not understand why God is silent in your life right now, but what you can hold on to is the certainty that he is working in ways you can't yet see. His silence isn't a signal of abandonment. It's an invitation to trust him even more. In the stillness, he is asking you to lean into his presence, to wait patiently for his timing, and to surrender your fears and worries to him. God doesn't work on our timetable, but his silence doesn't mean he's forgotten you. It means he's preparing you for something greater. So when you find yourself in the midst of God's silence, don't lose heart. It's not a void, it's a space of sacred opportunity, a space where God is refining your character, deepening your trust, and helping you learn to hear him in ways that go beyond the noise of this world. Embrace the silence, for it's in the quiet that God can do his most profound work in your life. Remember, God's silence is never the absence of his presence. It's simply the space where he asks you to wait, to listen, and to trust him more than ever before. There are moments in life when the silence of God can feel unbearable. You may be going through something difficult, something painful, and you cry out to him, but you hear nothing. No response. It's as though your prayers are bouncing off the walls and vanishing into thin air. Yet in these moments, it's important to understand that God's silence doesn't mean he's not listening. It means he's teaching you to trust him in ways you've never known before. You see, we are a generation that has become so accustomed to instant gratification. We want answers right away. We want everything now, from technology to relationships to our spiritual lives. But God doesn't operate on our timeline. His ways and timing are different from ours, and sometimes he remains silent to teach us patience, endurance, and trust. When we encounter silence, it's easy to feel abandoned. We may question God's love or wonder if he's hurt us at all. But silence, in the spiritual sense, can be a profound invitation to go deeper. It's as though God is inviting us into a deeper relationship with Him, one that requires us to go beyond the surface level and trust Him in the depths of our souls. Silence from God often comes when He's preparing us for something greater. Maybe it's a new season, a new challenge, or a new calling. He is working behind the scenes in ways that we cannot understand, and silence forces us to trust in His sovereignty and His perfect plan. Think of it this way. When a teacher is silent during an exam, it's not because they've abandoned the student. It's because they trust the student enough to allow them to work through the problems on their own. God does the same with us. He knows we are capable of growing and learning through the silence, and sometimes He allows us to face moments of uncertainty so that our faith can be strengthened. It's during these times that we are called to lean not on our own understanding, but on God's truth. We need to remember that silence is not the absence of God. It's a space where we can draw closer to Him by exercising faith, even in the unknown. In those moments, God is not distant. He is right there walking with us, even when we cannot see Him. He is molding us, shaping us, and preparing us for what's to come. When God is silent, He's often waiting for us to trust Him more fully. Silence invites us to step out in faith, to rely on Him rather than our own understanding. If you're facing a season where you feel like God is silent, don't be discouraged. Use it as an opportunity to grow in your trust and dependence on Him. God may not be speaking in the way you expect, but He's still speaking through His Word, His presence, and His faithfulness. Trust that He's there even when the silence is loud, because in His silence, there's an invitation to discover the depth of His love and faithfulness in ways that words alone cannot explain. In the midst of God's silence, there is often a deeper message that we are not yet able to hear clearly. You may be in a season where God has remained silent for a while, and it feels like you've exhausted all avenues of communication with Him. But what if God's silence is His way of preparing you for something greater? Perhaps He's asking you to step into a new season of your life, and He is quiet to help you fully rely on Him for the direction you need. Sometimes silence doesn't mean a lack of communication. It's an invitation to listen more intently, to tune out the distractions around you, and to focus on what He's trying to teach you in this moment. In these times, the silence can feel deafening, but it's in these moments of quiet that we can often hear God the clearest, not in words, but in the stillness of our hearts. Silence forces us to become more in tune with what God wants to reveal to us. When we are desperate for answers, we might seek noise and activity as a way to avoid dealing with the uncertainty. But God's silence often reveals the deep places in our souls that need to be addressed. It's in silence that we can examine our own hearts, allow God to reveal hidden areas of sin, and grow in our understanding of Him. Silence makes us confront our fears, our anxieties, and the places where we've been avoiding God's voice. It's not easy, but it's essential. Silence makes us face what is real and forces us to deal with our own dependence on God. It's not that He's forgotten about us. It's that He is calling us to recognize our need for Him and to find peace in the quiet moments. When God is silent, He may be teaching you the art of waiting. Waiting is not passive. It's an active process of trusting God's timing, of resting in His promises, and of believing that He will reveal His plan at the right moment. Think of waiting as a period of refining, just like gold that must be purified in the fire. Your faith is being tested and your trust in God is being deepened. Even when you don't hear Him speaking directly, He is present with you in the silence, teaching you patience, persistence, and faith. Instead of rushing through these moments, learn to embrace them. Trust that God is still at work in ways you cannot see or understand yet. The silence is not a sign that God has abandoned you, but rather that He's preparing you for something even greater than you can imagine. Allow His silence to deepen your faith and to strengthen your relationship with Him. Keep pressing in, keep praying, and keep seeking, knowing that God's silence is not the end of the story. It's just part of the journey. There are moments when we feel like God is completely absent from our lives. We are overwhelmed by challenges, perhaps dealing with personal struggles, sickness, or heartbreak. And no matter how many times we pray, we hear nothing in response. God's silence in these times can feel like an unbearable weight, and it can lead us to question His presence or His love for us. But here's the truth. God's silence doesn't equate to absence. In fact, God is often the closest to us when we feel like He's the farthest away. There are powerful reasons why God remains silent at times, and understanding these reasons can bring peace, healing, and clarity in the midst of our suffering. One of the reasons God might be silent is to help us grow in our faith. As much as we desire instant answers and immediate solutions, God knows that spiritual maturity often comes through the testing of our faith. He understands that we learn to trust Him not by having all our questions answered right away, but by learning to rely on Him even when we don't have all the answers. It's in the waiting, the silence, that our hearts are shaped and refined. When we're faced with a challenge, we can either turn to God in faith or turn away in frustration. The choice is ours, and often God's silence invites us to lean into Him in a deeper way. If everything were always clear and easy, we wouldn't need to grow in the way that challenges require. Now, God's silence then becomes an opportunity to strengthen our relationship with Him, to depend on Him in ways that wouldn't be possible if everything was going perfectly. Another reason for God's silence is to reveal something deeper about our own hearts. Sometimes when we're in the midst of struggle, we can become consumed with our own desires, our own worries, and our own plans. God might remain silent to allow us to truly examine our hearts and our motives. When we're still and waiting, we're more likely to listen to what's really going on inside of us. Our fears, insecurities, and even misplaced priorities can become clear during times of silence. God's silence is often a gift because it offers us the space to listen to Him, to ourselves, and to the work He's doing in our hearts. If we're too busy with noise and activity, we might miss the opportunity for self-reflection that God is offering. In this quiet, He can reveal areas of our lives that need healing, transformation, and growth. So when God seems silent, don't see it as abandonment. See it as an invitation. God is inviting you to step into a deeper relationship with Him, to trust Him even more fully, and to allow Him to work in ways that are beyond what you can currently comprehend. In the moments when we feel like God is silent, it's easy to become disheartened, to feel like we've been forgotten or abandoned. But what if God's silence is actually a sign of something deeply profound and beautiful? What if it's not a rejection, but an invitation to trust Him more fully and to experience His presence in a new way? Silence, when it comes from God, is never empty. It's full of meaning. One of the ways that God uses silence is to draw us closer to Him. In our busy, noisy lives, it's easy to forget just how important it is to spend time with God. We can become so caught up in our work, relationships, and everyday tasks that we forget the power of simply being in His presence. Silence has a way of clearing away the distractions, creating space for God to speak to our hearts. Sometimes when we're drowning in noise, we miss the quiet whispers of God that can only be heard in the stillness. God's silence then can be a call for us to slow down and make space for Him in our lives. It's an invitation to listen, to hear His voice in a way that we wouldn't be able to if we were distracted by the noise of the world around us. In the silence, we can hear God's heart more clearly. It's in these moments of quiet that we realize just how desperately we need Him. Without the constant busyness and distractions, we're forced to confront the truth. We can't do life without Him. We need His guidance, His strength, and His peace. God's silence, therefore, is not something to fear. It's something to embrace. It's a reminder that we are not in control and that we need to rely on God's wisdom, not our own. By accepting His silence, we open ourselves to a deeper, more intimate relationship with Him. God's silence is not a denial of His presence. It's an opportunity for us to discover Him in a way we might never have experienced before. When we trust Him during the quiet moments, we build a faith that can withstand the storms of life. So the next time you feel like God is silent, don't despair. Instead, take it as a sign to draw near to Him. God's silence is never without purpose, and in it there's an invitation to grow in trust, faith, and love. There are times when God's silence is not just a test of our patience, but also a call to action. Silence can stir something within us, an urgency to seek, to pray, and to draw near to God with all our hearts. When God is silent, we may feel like we're walking in the dark, but the truth is, silence can be the very thing that draws us into the light of God's presence. It's in the quiet moments that we are given the opportunity to search our hearts, to examine our lives, and to reflect on where we are with God. We are often so quick to move on to the next task, the next distraction, that we fail to recognize the invitation God has placed before us in His silence. God may remain silent not to punish us, but to teach us how to seek Him more earnestly. It's easy to pray when we're in crisis, when we're desperate for an answer. But how often do we pray when everything is calm? How often do we seek God when there's no immediate need or worry pressing us? Silence from God can be a wake-up call for us to seek Him not just when we're in trouble, but as a daily habit, coming to Him in quiet moments, listening to His voice, and making space for Him in our lives. It's during the times when God is silent that we are called to draw closer, not to retreat. Silence is an invitation to search our hearts and listen to God more deeply. When God is silent, He's not asking us to give up, but to press in. When we seek Him in the quiet, we find that He is closer than we realize. When He speaks, it will be in ways that are deeply meaningful, because we have learned to listen with open hearts and ears. So the next time God seems silent, don't back away. Step forward, seek Him in the stillness, and trust that in the quiet moments He is preparing something powerful in your life. In times when God seems silent, many of us are tempted to believe that He has abandoned us, or worse, that He no longer cares about what we are going through. Right. But it is essential to understand that silence does not always mean absence. In fact, God's silence can often be a powerful indication of His presence in our lives. It might be hard to grasp in the moment, but His silence is not a sign of His neglect. Instead, it's an invitation for us to grow, to dig deeper, and to trust Him even when we can't hear His voice clearly. Imagine for a moment that a parent is standing right beside their child, offering love, support, and guidance, but for a brief time, the parent says nothing. The child might feel abandoned, but the truth is, the parent's presence is still very much there. The parent is letting the child grow in independence and learn to trust their instincts. Similarly, in God's silence, He is allowing us to grow in our dependence on Him. Silence creates space for us to develop a deeper faith. And in that space, we begin to learn what it means to truly trust God with our hearts and lives, even when we cannot hear His voice. It teaches us to stop seeking instant answers and to develop a more intimate and sustained relationship with God. When we feel abandoned, God is inviting us to surrender our need for immediate answers and to trust in His perfect timing. There are times when we long for God to speak directly to our hearts, to give us the guidance we desperately need. But instead of clarity, we are met with silence. This silence can feel deafening, and it can be easy to wonder if God has turned away from us. However, the Bible teaches us that God's ways are not our ways, and His understanding is far beyond our own. In Isaiah 55:8-9, God says, "And my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways." This verse reminds us that even when we don't understand why God seems silent, His purposes are still unfolding. God's silence is not a failure to act. It's not a sign of apathy or neglect. It's simply part of the mystery of how He works in our lives. Often when we face difficult circumstances, we expect God to answer us immediately, to give us the comfort we think we need right then and there. But sometimes, God allows us to experience the silence so that we learn to trust His plan even when we can't see what He is doing behind the scenes. Just because we cannot hear Him in the moment does not mean He isn't at work. God's silence can be a reminder that He is sovereign and in control. It teaches us to trust not only in what He says, but also in what He does, even when it is unseen. So when God seems silent rather than despairing, we should lean into the understanding that His silence has a purpose. He is not absent. He is preparing us for something greater, helping us build a kind of faith that does not rely on immediate gratification, but on His perfect timing. When God is silent, it can feel as if we are walking through a desert with no water in sight. Every step feels heavy, every prayer feels unanswered, and the longing for direction and clarity grows stronger. In those moments, it is essential to remember that the silence is not something to be feared. Instead, it is an invitation to enter into a deeper relationship with God. It's an opportunity for us to learn to trust Him in ways we never have before. When we don't hear His voice, it forces us to rely not on our feelings, but on our faith. It is during these silent seasons that we can discover a richer, more intimate connection with God. It's not in the answers, but in the waiting that our relationship with God deepens. In the silence, we are called to be still, to rest in His presence, and to allow Him to work within us. This process often reveals our true reliance on Him, or the lack thereof. God wants us to move from being driven by our immediate emotions to being anchored in His eternal truth. When the silence feels overwhelming, it is in those moments that God is calling us to rest, not in our ability to understand His timing, but in His perfect will. Trusting in His silence is an act of faith, a declaration that we believe He is still at work, even when we cannot see the evidence. Silence becomes a sacred space where our faith is refined, and where we learn to trust God more deeply. Another profound aspect of God's silence is the way it helps to reveal what's truly in our hearts. When life is going well, when everything is as we desire it to be, it's easy to think that we have it all together. But when we are in the midst of a silent season, we can no longer hide from the deep questions and doubts that we have been avoiding. It's in the silence that we are forced to confront our fears, insecurities, and struggles. At times, God's silence allows us to see areas of our hearts that need healing, areas where we've become complacent, or where we've been relying too much on our own understanding. And God doesn't remain silent because He is punishing us. He remains silent to give us the opportunity to examine ourselves. The silence forces us to listen to the whispers of our soul, to become aware of where we may have drifted away from God, and to be honest with ourselves about our spiritual state. It's an opportunity to confess our worries, our fears, and our weaknesses before God. As we do this, we become more aware of the areas in which we need to grow. God's silence, then, is not merely a pause in communication. It's a tool that He uses to reveal what is in our hearts, to expose areas that need transformation, and to invite us into a deeper level of intimacy with Him. So when God is silent, instead of feeling abandoned, we should take the opportunity to examine our own hearts, to acknowledge our struggles, and to turn to God for the healing and strength we so desperately need. In the stillness of God's silence, we are given the chance to learn the true nature of patience. Patience is not just waiting passively for something to happen. It is an active waiting. It's about trusting that God knows what is best for us, even when we don't understand what is going on. So often in our fast-paced world, we have been conditioned to expect instant results. We want answers right now, and we want things to move on our timeline. But God's silence is a reminder that His timing is different from ours. It's in this silence that we learn to surrender our need for control and accept the reality that we can't rush God's plan. Patience in the waiting teaches us to be still, to stop striving, and to trust in the process. It allows us to recognize that God is not bound by the same constraints that we are. He sees the bigger picture, the entire story, while we only see a small part. In the quiet moments, we are invited to rest in the knowledge that God is working on our behalf, even when we can't see it. In the midst of silence, we learn that waiting is not a punishment, but a profound opportunity to grow in trust, endurance, and faith. As we wait, we begin to understand that God's silence is not His absence. It's a space where He is building something beautiful within us. When God is silent, it can feel like a deep disconnect. We may cry out to Him, asking for answers, for guidance, for comfort, and yet it feels as though our words are lost in the air. But in these moments, it's important to remember that God's silence does not equate to His absence. No. He is always present, even when we can't hear Him. In fact, God's silence is often a test of our faith. It's easy to trust God when everything is going well, when we feel His presence, and when our prayers are answered immediately. But it's in the moments of silence that our faith is truly tested. It's in those times when we can't hear God that we have the opportunity to choose to trust Him regardless of our circumstances. God is teaching us to trust in His character, not just in the answers He provides. His silence is an invitation to lean into His faithfulness, knowing that He has never failed us, and He never will. It's during these silent seasons that our faith matures and becomes stronger. We learn to walk by faith, not by sight. And when God's voice seems distant, we are given the chance to stand firm in the belief that He is still present, still working, and still faithful. God's silence is not an indication of His absence, but an invitation to trust Him in deeper and more profound ways. There is a powerful lesson in God's silence. It teaches us to rely on His word and not our own feelings. When we don't hear God's voice speaking to us directly, it's easy to become disoriented and confused. We may begin to rely on our emotions, our circumstances, or even our own understanding to guide us. But God's silence calls us to return to the foundation of our faith, His word. The Bible tells us that God's word is a lamp to our feet and a light to our path. In moments of silence, we are invited to dig deeper into Scripture, to find the wisdom and comfort that can sustain us when we feel alone. God's silence doesn't mean He's abandoned us. It's an opportunity to turn back to His word, to remind ourselves of His promises, and to trust that what He has spoken is true. When we feel like we can't hear Him, we are called to listen to the truth that has already been given to us. God's silence teaches us to stand on the unshakable foundation of His word and to trust that it will guide us through even the most uncertain times. So when God seems silent rather than looking for new answers, let us seek the truth of His word, knowing that it has the power to lead us through every situation we face. Sometimes when God is silent, we may feel as though our prayers are falling on deaf ears. We may wonder why our cries for help aren't being answered, why the situation hasn't changed, and why it feels like God isn't responding. But this is where we must remember that God's silence does not mean a lack of action. Just because we don't see an immediate change doesn't mean God isn't working. In fact, God is often doing more in the silence than we could ever imagine. Think of a seed that is planted in the soil. It doesn't immediately sprout or grow, but underneath the surface, it is growing roots, preparing for the moment when it will break through and grow. Similarly, in the silence, God is working beneath the surface, preparing us for something greater. He is shaping our hearts, deepening our faith, and building our endurance for what is to come. Just because we don't see immediate results doesn't mean God isn't working on our behalf. We must learn to trust that His silence is not a sign of neglect, but an indication that He is preparing something greater than we can imagine. Our role is to trust, to wait, and to remain faithful, knowing that God is working in ways we cannot see. The silence is part of the process, and it's in this space that God is doing His most transformative work. In the moments when God is silent, we must also remember that His silence can be a form of preparation. When we think about our lives, we often want things to move quickly. We want answers, solutions, and clarity, all in our timing. But God's silence is a reminder that He is preparing us for something deeper, something that will require our patience, our growth, and our trust. Just as a runner prepares for a race, training their body and mind before the event, God uses His silence to prepare us for the next stage of our journey. He knows that the challenges ahead will require us to be spiritually strong, emotionally resilient, and deeply rooted in our faith. Therefore, during times of silence, God is equipping us for the challenges and opportunities that are coming. He is strengthening our character, building our endurance, and teaching us to rely on Him in all circumstances. God's silence is not wasted. It is an essential part of His preparation process. So when we face silence, instead of feeling abandoned or forgotten, we can trust that God is getting us ready for something extraordinary. It may not make sense now, but in time, we will see the purpose behind His silence. And when we do, we'll realize that the silence was exactly what we needed to be fully prepared for the next chapter of our lives. When we experience God's silence, it's easy to become discouraged and begin doubting His presence or care for us. We may ask ourselves, why would God remain silent in my time of need? But the silence often comes as a reminder that God's ways are not our ways. His timing, His methods, and His understanding are far beyond anything we can fathom. It's important to realize that God is not absent. He is simply working in ways that we cannot see or understand. When we feel abandoned, it's crucial to remind ourselves that God's silence doesn't mean He has abandoned us. In fact, it is during these times of silence that He is shaping us for something greater. Sometimes God's silence is a loving call for us to step out in faith, to trust in His unseen work, and to continue moving forward even when we don't feel His immediate presence. He may not be answering our prayers in the way we expect, but that doesn't mean He is not answering them in the best way. God is at work behind the scenes, preparing us for the blessings and lessons ahead. Instead of giving in to doubt, we are invited to choose trust, knowing that even in silence, God is present and actively working for our good. During periods of silence, it's easy to become frustrated and question what we might have done wrong. We begin to wonder if we've done something to deserve this silence, thinking that perhaps our prayers are not worthy or that we've failed in some way. But this mindset can be a trap. God does not distance himself from us because of our shortcomings. Rather, his silence is often a test of faith, a call for us to trust in his sovereignty. The silence doesn't indicate punishment. It often indicates preparation. God is refining us, purifying our hearts, and strengthening our relationship with him in ways that are not immediately apparent. It's in these times of silence that we develop resilience, patience, and deep-rooted faith. When God is silent, it's not because he is punishing us, but because he's giving us the space we need to grow. He is inviting us to take this time to learn how to trust him, to depend on him, and to seek his will even when we cannot hear his voice as clearly. Trusting God through the silence strengthens our relationship with him, and as we learn to wait on him, we develop the maturity that will carry us through future challenges. So instead of asking, "What did I do wrong?" ask yourself, "How can I grow through this silence?" This is where God is working in you, teaching you to trust and walk by faith rather than by sight. God's silence is often a gift in disguise. It might not feel like it in the moment, but silence provides us with an opportunity for deep reflection, self-examination, and spiritual growth. In the busyness of life, it can be easy to overlook the lessons God is trying to teach us. But when he is silent, he creates a space for us to slow down and listen. We live in a world that thrives on constant noise, activity, and distractions. We are always on the go, always busy, and sometimes we don't leave enough room for God to speak to us. In these moments of silence, God is calling us to stop and pay attention. He wants to speak to us not just through our circumstances, but through the quiet spaces in our lives. His silence invites us to draw closer to him, to listen more intently, and to learn how to be still before him. It is in the silence that we can hear his gentle voice more clearly, without the distractions of the world competing for our attention. Rather than seeing God's silence as a void, we can choose to view it as an opportunity for deeper communion with him. Silence becomes the fertile soil where God can plant the seeds of his will for our lives, where he can mold us into the people he has called us to be. When we face God's silence, it's important to remember that his silence is not permanent. It is a season, and just as with all seasons in life, it will pass. God's silence is not meant to last forever, and it doesn't mean that he is not active in our lives. Just like winter gives way to spring, God's silence will eventually give way to his voice, his guidance, and his direction. In the meantime, we are called to wait with patience, to trust in his timing, and to rest in his promises. The silence we experience now is not a permanent state. It's part of a larger process that is unfolding according to God's perfect plan. While we may not understand the reasons for the silence or the timing of it, we can trust that God's plan is always better than our own. He knows what we need when we need it, and how to prepare us for what's ahead. Our job is to trust him during this time of silence, knowing that he will speak at just the right moment. And when he does, it will be clear that his timing was perfect, and his silence was part of the process that led us to a deeper understanding of his will for our lives. In the silence of God, we are given the chance to practice surrender. Surrendering to God is not always easy, especially when we are facing uncertainty, pain, or confusion. When we can't hear God's voice clearly, we may be tempted to take matters into our own hands, to try and fix things ourselves, or to find our own solutions. But God's silence invites us to surrender our need for control. It teaches us to let go and allow God to work in his way and in his time. Surrendering during periods of silence requires a deep trust in God's goodness and his ability to bring about what is best for us. It is in these times that we are called to lay down our worries, our fears, and our own plans, and trust that God's plan is greater. Surrender is not about giving up. It's about giving control over to the one who knows us better than we know ourselves. God's silence is an opportunity for us to grow in our surrender, to recognize that his will is far greater than anything we could ever imagine. And when we finally release our grip and trust in His perfect timing, we will see how much peace and freedom come from surrendering to God's will, even when we cannot see the full picture. When God remains silent, it can feel like a heavy burden, and we might wonder if we're doing something wrong or if God has simply turned away from us. But it's crucial to understand that silence does not equate to abandonment. Sometimes God's silence is a way of teaching us something deeply important about ourselves and our faith. It forces us to reflect and search our hearts in a way that we might not otherwise do if everything were going smoothly. Silence challenges us to dig deeper into our faith and become more intentional in our relationship with God. It compels us to seek God with greater intensity, not for the answers we want to hear, but for the answers He knows we need. The silence we experience is not a punishment or a sign of rejection. Instead, it is an invitation from God to trust Him more deeply. He wants us to depend on Him, to lean into His love, and to hold on to His promises, even when we cannot feel or see Him clearly. God's silence teaches us to rely not on our feelings, but on our faith. It challenges us to believe that He is still at work in our lives, even when we cannot hear His voice directly. The truth is, silence can be one of the most powerful tools God uses to build our faith and draw us closer to Him. So during these times, instead of feeling discouraged, we are invited to embrace the silence as an opportunity for growth and deeper trust in His plan. In times of silence, we often feel the urge to rush ahead, to take action, to force a response from God. We may try to fill the silence with distractions, noise, or activity, hoping that by doing so, God will somehow respond. But what if the silence is meant to teach us patience? Patience, what if the silence is calling us to wait and to trust in God's perfect timing? It is in the waiting that we learn to let go of control and surrender to God's will. Waiting may not always feel comfortable, but it is in this waiting that we learn to grow in faith. God's silence is not a void. It's a space where He's preparing us for what is to come. It's a period where our hearts and minds are being prepared to receive His answers in the right way. Just as the earth needs time to rest before it can produce a bountiful harvest, we too need moments of stillness and silence to prepare ourselves for the blessings God is preparing for us. So in the silence, instead of rushing, take a deep breath, sit in His presence, and wait with anticipation. God is using this time to shape you, mold you, and strengthen your faith in ways that you can't fully understand yet. The more you learn to wait with patience and trust, the more you will see His plan unfolding in your life in ways that will leave you in awe of His goodness. God's silence often leads us into deeper intimacy with Him. It is during times of silence that we may find ourselves praying more earnestly, seeking His will more diligently, and desiring His presence more fully. The silence serves as an invitation to draw near to God. In our busy lives, we can sometimes take our relationship with God for granted. But when He is silent, it creates an opportunity for us to reconnect with Him in a more intentional way. It's in these moments of quiet that we can listen more attentively to His still, small voice. When everything else around us is calm and still, we can hear God's voice more clearly, without the distractions and noise of the world crowding out His whispers. Silence doesn't mean that God has stopped speaking. It means that He is speaking in a different way. Sometimes God wants us to stop talking, stop asking, and simply be still in His presence. It's in these times that He draws us closer to Himself. He wants us to know Him more deeply, not just as the one who answers our prayers, but as our Father, our Savior, our constant companion. The silence is an invitation to deepen that relationship, to spend more time with God, and to grow in our love for Him. God's silence doesn't mean He loves us less. It often means He is calling us to seek Him more fervently and to experience His love in a new and profound way. One of the greatest lessons we can learn during God's silence is the importance of trusting in His sovereignty. Even when we don't hear from Him directly, we must trust that He is still in control. Silence is not an indication of chaos or loss of control. Rather, it is an opportunity to reaffirm our trust in God's perfect plan. In those moments when we feel the weight of uncertainty, we must choose to remember that God is always sovereign. His silence does not negate His power or His promises. The Bible is filled with examples of times when God was silent, but His silence never meant He was inactive. Instead, it was part of a larger plan that was unfolding in ways that could not be immediately seen. When God is silent, it is a reminder that his ways are not our ways. He sees the bigger picture, and we must trust that he is working behind the scenes to bring about his will. Trusting in God's sovereignty during periods of silence allows us to rest in the peace that comes from knowing he is in control. No matter what we face, no matter how long the silence lasts, we can trust that God is at work, moving in ways that we cannot yet understand, and that he will never leave us nor forsake us. In times of silence, we can often experience a deepening of our spiritual maturity. When everything is going smoothly, it's easy to be confident in our faith. But when God is silent, it can reveal the true depth of our trust in him. Are we willing to continue following God even when we cannot hear his voice? Are we able to maintain our faith when we don't feel his presence? It's in these moments of silence that our faith is refined and purified. We are forced to move beyond the surface-level faith that thrives only in good times and develop a more resilient, steadfast faith that can endure through the hard times. Just as gold is purified by fire, our faith is strengthened through periods of silence. God allows silence to test and strengthen our faith, to help us grow in our dependence on him. In these moments, we have the chance to develop a deeper trust in God's character. His silence is not a reflection of his abandonment, but rather a tool for developing a faith that will carry us through the toughest seasons of life. So instead of shrinking away from the silence, let it be an opportunity to press into God, to lean into his promises, and to trust that he is doing something powerful in your heart during this time. In the midst of God's silence, it can be easy to feel forgotten, isolated, and uncertain about his plan for our lives. But there is something incredibly profound that happens during these moments. It is during the silence that we are forced to confront the deepest parts of our hearts, where we may be holding on to fears, insecurities, or even doubts. The silence acts like a mirror, reflecting back to us the areas in our lives where we need to grow. Instead of seeing this as a void, it's important to understand that God is using this time to reveal something within us that needs attention. Perhaps there is a lack of trust that needs to be addressed, a prayer that we haven't fully surrendered, or a dependency on ourselves that needs to be broken. God's silence is not a reflection of his disinterest, but a tool of transformation. Just as a refiner's fire purifies gold, his silence refines our hearts, allowing us to emerge stronger and more aligned with his will. During this time, God is preparing us for something greater. He may be removing distractions, healing wounds, or working in ways that we cannot immediately perceive. In these moments, our faith grows, and we learn to lean more on God, not because of what we can immediately feel or see, but because of who he is. The silence is a call to trust, to wait, and to allow God to work within us without rushing the process. God's silence can often feel like an overwhelming absence, but in reality, it can also be a time of divine quietness, a space in which we can hear his voice more clearly. We live in a world filled with constant noise, constant messages, notifications, and distractions that pull our attention in 100 different directions. In the midst of all this, it can become difficult to recognize God's voice. However, God knows this. He understands that we need moments of silence to reset, to recalibrate our hearts, and to truly hear from him. The stillness offers us an opportunity to quiet our hearts and minds, to push away the noise, and to focus entirely on him. It's in these moments of quiet that God can speak to us in a deeper, more intimate way. The silence becomes a sacred space where we can listen with our spirits rather than just with our ears. God may not always speak in loud, obvious ways, but his voice is still present in the stillness. In those times when we can no longer rely on our own understanding or emotions, we find ourselves leaning in more closely to hear what God is whispering to us. His silence is an invitation to develop a deeper sensitivity to his voice, to attune ourselves to his presence in a world full of distractions. It's in this divine quietness that we experience God in ways that speak directly to our hearts, without the interference of our own plans or expectations. When God is silent, it's easy to feel that he's forgotten us, or that we've done something wrong. But more often than not, God's silence is a sign of his deep trust in us. Think about it. God doesn't need to speak to us constantly. He knows what's in our hearts, and He knows the potential He's placed within us. In times of silence, He's allowing us the opportunity to exercise the very faith and trust we claim to have in Him. Silence pushes us to dig deeper, to grow stronger in our conviction, and to rely more on God's word than on our feelings or circumstances. Sometimes God allows silence because He knows we're capable of weathering the storm without a direct word from Him. It's in these moments that we have the opportunity to stretch our faith, to stand firm on the promises He's already given us, and to press forward even when we can't see the way ahead. Silence in this sense is not abandonment, but an invitation to strengthen our resolve, to trust in what we know to be true, and to lean into God's power even when we don't have all the answers. It's a beautiful reminder that God believes in our ability to remain faithful, even when we cannot hear His voice as clearly. Sometimes God's silence is meant to lead us into a deeper sense of prayer and dependence on Him. When we face a situation where we cannot hear from God, it forces us to approach Him with an entirely different mindset. Instead of asking for a quick answer or a solution, we begin to learn the value of seeking Him for His presence, rather than His answers. God's silence may initially feel frustrating or even discouraging, but if we allow it to, it will teach us the importance of drawing near to Him simply because He is God, not because of what we want from Him. Prayer becomes less about asking for things and more about deepening our relationship with God. We begin to understand that prayer is not a transactional act, but a transformative one. It's an invitation to align our hearts with God's will, to lay our worries and anxieties at His feet, and to trust Him with the outcome, even when the answers are not immediately clear. The silence encourages us to seek God for who He is, not just for what He can do for us. It allows us to build a relationship of trust and intimacy with our Creator, recognizing that our worth and purpose are found in Him alone. God's silence doesn't separate us from Him. Rather, it draws us into a deeper conversation with Him. It's an opportunity to connect on a level that goes beyond mere requests and petitions, and into a place of worship, reverence, and complete surrender. Another powerful aspect of God's silence is the invitation to reflect on His faithfulness. It's easy to trust God when we can see the evidence of His work in our lives, when everything is going well, and our prayers are answered in the way we hoped. But God's silence teaches us to trust Him even when we can't see the evidence. In times of silence, we're forced to rely on our memories of God's past faithfulness, on the promises He has already spoken over our lives, and on the assurance that He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. This is the moment to reflect on the many times He has shown up for you in the past, the countless prayers He has answered, and the miracles He has performed. Even when you can't see the next step, you can trust that God has been with you every step of the way. His silence doesn't mean He has abandoned you. It means He is allowing you to lean into the trust you've built over time. When God is silent, take a moment to remember the countless ways He has been faithful to you. Reflect on His goodness, His love, and His ability to turn all things for good. By remembering God's faithfulness, you build a foundation that will help you stand strong in the silence, knowing that He will never leave you nor forsake you. In the silence of God, there is an incredible opportunity for personal growth. When God is silent, it often means He is working in ways that we can't immediately understand. Our human nature craves immediate answers and clear directions, but God's silence invites us to exercise patience, trust, and perseverance. In these moments, God is refining our character, teaching us to rely on Him, even when we can't hear His voice as clearly. This is where true faith is tested. Not in the moments when things are going well and prayers are answered quickly, in the moments of quiet when we must choose to trust God without visible signs. These moments provide fertile ground for growth, allowing us to develop a deeper, more steadfast faith. It's in the silence that we come to terms with our dependence on God, recognizing that we cannot control every aspect of our lives, and that ultimately God's plan for us is far better than our own. His silence isn't a punishment, but a tool that He uses to strengthen our resolve, deepen our trust, and prepare us for greater purposes. It's in those times of waiting when the answers don't come immediately that we are shaped into the individuals God has called us to be. When God is silent, we learn to lean into Him even more, letting go of our need for control and resting in His sovereign timing. God's silence is often misunderstood, but it is never without purpose. While we may struggle with impatience, frustration, or doubt during times of quiet, God is actively working behind the scenes to prepare us for what lies ahead. We live in a world that thrives on instant gratification, and in such an environment, waiting on God can feel like an unbearable challenge. However, it is precisely in this waiting that God shapes our character. The silence isn't a void. It's a space where God's transformative work can take place in our hearts. God's timing is always perfect, and while we may not see the bigger picture right now, we can trust that He is preparing us for something greater. Every moment of silence is an invitation to surrender our will and embrace His. Through this process, we learn to rely on God more deeply, trusting that His plan for us is far better than any plan we could craft for ourselves. Even when we don't understand why things are taking longer than we expect, God is still moving in our lives, working in ways that are often beyond our comprehension. In the silence, God is refining us, breaking down the parts of us that need to be surrendered and building up a stronger, more faithful version of ourselves. The silence of God can often reveal deep truths within our hearts, truths that we may not have been ready to confront before. When life is loud and busy, it's easy to hide from our emotions, our doubts, and our fears. But when God is silent, we are faced with ourselves in a way that is often uncomfortable yet necessary for growth. The quiet can be a mirror, reflecting the things we need to address. Perhaps unresolved pain, areas of unforgiveness, or places where we've allowed fear to control our actions. God's silence forces us to slow down, to examine our hearts, and to bring those hidden things into the light. It's a beautiful opportunity for healing and growth. In these moments, God may be revealing things in our lives that are standing in the way of His will for us. And the silence becomes a call to action, a call to deal with the things we may have been avoiding. Instead of seeing His silence as a punishment, we should embrace it as an invitation to a deeper, more authentic relationship with Him. God's silence invites us to sit in the discomfort, knowing that He is working within us, purging what needs to be removed and refining what needs to be strengthened. It's in this process that we experience real transformation, moving closer to the person God has designed us to be. One of the most powerful aspects of God's silence is its ability to draw us closer to Him. When life is full of noise and distractions, it's easy to forget how much we need God. We rely on our own strength, our own understanding, and our own plans. But in the silence, God strips us of those false securities, reminding us of our dependence on Him. This is when we learn to lean into His presence, to turn to Him in prayer, and to seek His guidance above all else. God's silence reveals the places where we have been depending on ourselves or on other people, and He gently calls us back to Himself. It's in these moments that we realize how much we need Him, not just for the answers to our prayers, but for His love, His peace, and His guidance. The silence creates a space where we can experience God in a deeper, more intimate way without the distractions of our everyday lives. It is in this stillness that we can hear God's voice more clearly, and our relationship with Him becomes more personal. In the quiet, God is not distant. He is drawing us closer, helping us understand that He is enough, even when nothing else makes sense. In the midst of God's silence, we are often called to trust His promises. Silence can sometimes feel like abandonment, but it's in these moments that God is calling us to remember His faithfulness. Throughout the Bible, we see that God's promises are always fulfilled, though not always in our timing. Whether it's the promise He made to Abraham, to Moses, or to David, we can trust that God keeps His word. When God is silent, it's a reminder to hold fast to the promises He has already given us. We may not understand why we are in a season of silence, but we can trust that God is working everything for our good. His silence does not negate His promises. It affirms them. In fact, it's often in the silence that we are able to experience the fullness of God's promises in a way we wouldn't have been able to before. When we lean into His promises, we begin to see His faithfulness in new and profound ways. The silence teaches us to wait on God's timing, trusting that He will come through for us just as He always has. When we cannot hear from God in the way we expect, we can trust that He is still at work, fulfilling His promises in ways we may not yet fully understand. His silence doesn't mean He is absent. It means He is preparing something greater for us. When God remains silent, we are presented with the opportunity to experience a deepening of our faith. The silence isn't a reflection of God's absence, but rather a powerful invitation to trust Him more fully. It's easy to lean on God when answers are immediate and tangible, but it's in the waiting, in the periods of uncertainty, that our faith is truly tested. Through His silence, God is teaching us to surrender our need for control and to trust that He is working behind the scenes, orchestrating every detail of our lives. Just as the farmer must wait for the harvest to grow, we too must wait for God's perfect timing. His silence is a reminder that His plan for our lives is always unfolding in ways that are far greater than we could ever imagine. And while we may not understand everything in the moment, we can take comfort in knowing that God's silence is not a refusal to act, but a space for our faith to mature. A faith to mature. Times of waiting are where God molds us into the people He has called us to be, stronger, wiser, more patient, and more trusting in His sovereign plan. So when you find yourself in a season of silence, remember that it is not a time of abandonment, but a divine invitation to rest in the knowledge that God is at work even when we cannot see it. Trust that He is guiding you, preparing you, and working all things together for your good. God's silence is not an end, but a beginning of a deeper relationship with Him and a more profound understanding of His perfect will for your life. The silence may feel uncomfortable, but in the end it will prove to be a time of incredible growth and transformation.